The year was 1888, and the wind across the high plains of Wyoming had a voice of its own. It was a lonesome sound, a ceaseless mourning that scraped against the weathered boards of Arthur McBride's cabin and swept across the vast, empty grasslands that stretched to a horizon jagged with distant, tooth-like mountains. For 2 years, since Martha's passing, that wind had been the only constant conversation in Arthur's life. It spoke of absence, of the hollow space she had left behind, a space so large it seemed to swallow the light from the sky. Arthur was a man carved from the same hard land he worked. His shoulders were broad from swinging an axe and hauling feed, his hands calloused and mapped with the fine lines of labor. Grief had settled into him not as a storm of weeping, but as a quiet, heavy frost. It silvered the edges of his dark hair and lived in the deep-set lines around his eyes. He moved with a purpose that was entirely mechanical, a list of chores that began before sunrise and ended long after the last sliver of light had bled from the sky. He mended fences, tended to his small herd of cattle, chopped wood, and existed. He did not live, he endured. His daughter, Clara, was a ghost in their small home. At 6 years old, she should have been a whirlwind of questions and laughter, but she was as quiet as the dust motes that danced in the slivers of afternoon sun. She had her mother's pale hair and serious blue eyes, eyes that seemed to hold a sorrow too old for her small frame. The silence that had claimed her father had enveloped her too. She spoke only when necessary, in whispers that felt fragile enough to be broken by a sudden noise. She played with a faceless doll Martha had sewn for her, her games as silent and solemn as a prayer. Arthur watched her, a dull ache constricting his chest. He knew he was failing her. He gave her food, shelter, a physical protection from the harshness of the world. But the core of him, the part a father was supposed to give, had been buried with his wife. Their life was a routine etched in stone. Breakfast was silent, supper was silent. In between, Arthur worked the land, and Clara stayed within sight of the cabin, a small, lonely figure against the immense backdrop of the prairie. The isolation was a fortress Arthur had built around his pain, but he was beginning to realize it was also a prison for his child. He saw the way she looked at the horizon, as if searching for something that was never going to arrive. He saw the way her shoulders hunched, as if carrying a burden that was invisible but immensely heavy. He was a man drowning in stillness, and he was pulling his daughter down with him. One afternoon in late summer, when the heat shimmered above the cured grasses, Arthur was riding the boundary of his property, checking a section of fence near Cottonwood Creek. The air was thick and still, the usual wind having died down to a breathless pause, as if the land itself held its breath. It was this unusual quiet that made him notice the splash of color against the pale stones of the creek bed, a patch of dark red and blue that did not belong to the natural palette of the plains. Dismounting from his horse, he approached with the ingrained caution of a man who lived alone in a wild place. His hand rested near the colt at his hip. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, a woman lying face down, half in the shallow water, her dark hair fanned out like spilled ink. She was native, dressed in worn but finely beaded buckskin. One of her legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark, ugly stain spread from a wound on her side. Arthur's first instinct was a cold, hard knot of refusal. This was trouble. Trouble he did not need, did not want. The nearest town, Bighorn, was a full day's ride, and its citizens held no love for the Cheyenne or the Arapaho, whose ancestral lands this was. To involve himself was to invite judgment, suspicion, and possibly violence. He could ride away, pretend he had never seen her. The coyotes and the unforgiving sun would do the rest. It was the law of the prairie. He stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in on him. The woman did not move. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her back. She was still alive. He thought of Martha, how she had wasted away from the fever, how he had been helpless to stop it. He thought of Clara, alone back at the cabin, her silence a mirror of his own. To leave this woman to die felt like another kind of surrender, another piece of his humanity he would be leaving to bleach under the sun. With a curse that was more a prayer of resignation, he strode forward. He knelt in the cool water, his knees sinking into the soft mud. Gently, he turned her over. Her face was gaunt, her lips cracked and blue. A fever burned in her skin, a dry, dangerous heat. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, dark and clouded with pain and delirium, before sliding shut again. She was young, perhaps no older than Martha had been. He looked around, scanning the empty landscape. There was no one, no tracks but her own, staggering and uneven, leading from the east. She was alone, fleeing what or from whom he couldn't know. The decision, once made, settled in him with a grim finality. He could not leave her. Whatever his heart had become, it was not yet barren enough for that. With a grunt of effort, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. As he lifted her, a faint, pained sound escaped her lips. It was the first human voice, other than his own or Clara's whisper, that he had heard on his land in months. He carried her to his horse, mounted with difficulty, and turned for home, the unconscious woman, a profound and dangerous disruption held tight against him. Clara was on the porch, a small sentinel watching his approach. Her eyes widened as she saw the figure slumped in front of her father. She didn't speak, but a flicker of something fear, or maybe just pure shock, crossed her face. "Go inside, Clara," Arthur said, his voice rough. "Get a blanket. Put the kettle on the stove." The child vanished without a word. Inside, the cabin felt small and cluttered with the woman's presence. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only proper bed besides Clara's small one. The movement jostled her, and her eyes opened again, this time with a sliver of awareness. Fear, stark and raw, flashed in their depths. She tried to push herself up, a weak, desperate movement. "Easy now," Arthur said, keeping his voice low and even. "You're safe here." The words felt foreign on his tongue. Safe. This place hadn't felt safe to him in years. It had only felt empty. The woman stared at him, her gaze darting from his face to the rifle leaning against the wall, then to the closed door. He was a white man, a stranger. To her, he was likely the very definition of danger. Clara appeared at his elbow, holding out a worn woolen blanket. She looked from her father to the woman on the cot, her expression unreadable. Arthur took the blanket and covered the woman, then turned his attention to her injuries. The wound in her side was a nasty gash, inflamed and oozing. Her ankle was swollen and discolored. He was no doctor, but he knew infection and a broken bone when he saw them. For the next few days, a tense and silent routine established itself. Arthur cleaned and dressed the wound with hot water and carbolic soap from his meager medical supplies. He splinted her ankle with 2 flat pieces of kindling and strips of torn flour sack. He spooned broth and water between her cracked lips, forcing her to drink when she was too weak to lift her own head. He did it all with a detached efficiency, a grim focus that kept his own thoughts at bay. He was not helping a person, he was fixing a problem that had landed on his doorstep. But she was a person. During the long nights, as he sat in a chair by the hearth, watching over her while Clara slept, the wall of his detachment began to crumble. In the grip of the fever, she would murmur in her own tongue, her words soft and rhythmic, like a song or a prayer. Sometimes she would cry out, a sharp sound of pain or terror that made Arthur's own heart clench. He saw not just an Indian, a stranger, but a woman in agony, haunted by her own ghosts. Vivina, as he would later learn her name was, fought for her life with a silent, stubborn ferocity. The fever raged for 3 days, and twice Arthur was sure he would lose her. But on the 4th morning, he walked into the cabin after morning chores to find her awake, her eyes clear for the first time. The fever had broken. She was watching him, her gaze no longer clouded by delirium, but sharp with an intelligent, assessing caution. He nodded at her, a gesture that felt awkward and insufficient. "You're looking better." She said nothing, just continued to watch him as he moved about the small room, stoking the fire, preparing a thin gruel of oats. Clara sat at the small table, her head bent over her doll, but Arthur could feel her attention fixed on the woman in the cot. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of grief, but a charged silence, heavy with questions and uncertainties. He brought the bowl of gruel to the cot. Vivina pushed herself up, wincing as her body protested. She took the bowl from him, her fingers brushing his. Her hands were slender, with long, graceful fingers. She ate slowly, deliberately, never taking her eyes off him. When she was finished, she held the empty bowl out to him. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were quiet, raspy from disuse, but her English was clear. Arthur was taken aback. He just nodded again and took the bowl. That single, soft-spoken phrase seemed to alter the very air in the room. It was an acknowledgement, a bridge across the chasm of silence and mistrust that had separated them. Over the next week, Vivina's strength slowly returned. She began to sit up for longer periods, her back straight and proud against the rough-hewn wall. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in short, functional sentences. But she watched everything. She watched Arthur as he repaired a piece of tack, his large, capable hands moving with surprising deftness. She watched the way he spoke to his horses, a gentleness in his voice that he never used with people. And most of all, she watched Clara. Clara, in turn, watched her back. The child would hover near the edge of the main room, a tiny satellite orbiting this new, strange presence in her world. She would watch as Vivina painstakingly rebraided her long black hair. She would watch as Vivina's fingers moved, mending a tear in her own buckskin dress with a needle Arthur had given her and thread pulled from a worn shirt. There was a quiet intensity to their mutual observation, a silent conversation happening in a language Arthur did not understand. The turning point came one grey afternoon. Arthur was outside splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. He glanced toward the cabin and saw, through the open doorway, Vivina beckoning to Clara. The child hesitated, clutching her faceless doll. Vivina said something soft, too low for him to hear, and patted the floor beside the cot. After a long moment, Clara shuffled forward and sat down, keeping a careful distance. Arthur stopped his work, leaning on the handle of his axe, watching. He saw Vivina pick up a small piece of scrap wood from the kindling box and a knife from the kitchen counter. With slow, careful movements, she began to carve. Clara watched, mesmerized, as a shape began to emerge from the wood. It was a bird, its wings half spread, its head tilted as if listening. Vivina worked with an unhurried grace, her hands seeming to know the spirit of the wood. When she was done, she sanded it smooth with a piece of rough stone from the hearth and held it out to Clara. The little girl looked at the bird, then up at Vivina's face. For the first time since Martha died, a genuine, wondrous smile spread across Clara's face. She reached out and took the small wooden bird, her fingers tracing its smooth curves. "Bird," Clara whispered, the word clear and bright. Vivina smiled back, a soft, tired smile that nonetheless lit up her face. "Yes," she said, "Kestaye." From his place by the woodpile, Arthur felt something shift inside him, a thawing around the edges of his frozen heart. He had given his daughter a roof and food, but this woman, a stranger he had rescued out of a reluctant sense of duty, had just given her a piece of joy. She had broken through a silence he had long accepted as permanent. That small act of kindness was a seed. In the days that followed, a fragile garden of connection began to grow in the barren soil of their lives. Vivina, though still weak and limping on her splintered ankle, began to take on a role in the household. She taught Clara how to weave rushes from the creek into small baskets. She would hum quiet, haunting melodies as she worked, and Clara would sit beside her, humming along, her small voice a stark contrast to the months of quiet. Vivina started talking more, sharing pieces of her story in fragmented sentences. Her husband had taken a job scouting for the railroad, an act that had ostracized them from their band. They were traveling to a new territory to start over when they were set upon by white traders looking for trouble. Her husband was killed. She had fled, running for days until she collapsed. Listening to her, Arthur felt a pang of shame for his initial suspicion. Her tragedy was not so different from his own. Both of them were survivors, adrift in a world that had taken everything from them. One evening, as a cool autumn wind whistled around the corners of the cabin, Arthur found himself telling her about Martha. He spoke of her laughter, of the garden she had tried to grow in the unforgiving soil, of her dream of having a house full of children. The words came out haltingly at first, then flowed more easily, a river of grief finally allowed to run its course. Vivina listened without interruption, her dark eyes filled with a profound, quiet empathy. When he finished, the silence that fell between them was no longer tense or empty, but comfortable, filled with a shared understanding of loss. "She is still with you," Vivina said softly, gesturing to Clara, who was asleep in her cot, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. In her. Arthur looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, and saw not just the ghost of his wife, but the living, breathing miracle of her. And he saw that the light was starting to come back into her eyes. That light was Vivina's doing. The rhythm of their lives found a new cadence. It was a rhythm of three. Arthur would work the ranch, but his movements were no longer purely mechanical. He found himself looking forward to coming back to the cabin, to the smell of stew simmering on the stove, to the sound of Clara's occasional wondrous laughter. Vivina, her ankle healing, moved about the cabin with a quiet grace, her presence a balm on the raw wounds of the house. She brought with her a knowledge of the land that Arthur, for all his years on it, had never possessed. She showed him which roots were good for soup, which leaves could be brewed into a tea to soothe a cough. She was weaving herself into the fabric of their lives, and the tapestry was becoming stronger, more vibrant than it had ever been. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. The first frost had silvered the prairie when Arthur knew he had to make a trip to Bighorn for supplies. They were low on flour, salt, and coffee. He was reluctant to leave Vivina and Clara, but even more reluctant to take them with him. The town was a place of hard stares and harder judgments. "I must go with you," Vivina said, her jaw set with a quiet determination. She had seen his hesitation. "I cannot hide forever, and you should not hide me." He argued, but she was firm. She had a pride and a strength that he had come to admire. And so, with a deep sense of foreboding, they hitched the wagon and made the long journey to town. Clara sat between them, a small, warm presence, looking at the world with new, curious eyes. Bighorn was just as Arthur remembered it. A single, dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, and a livery. The moment they pulled up in front of the store, the town's attention fixed on them like a hawk spotting a mouse. Faces appeared in windows. Men loafing on the porch of the saloon stopped talking and turned to stare. Their gazes were hostile, suspicious, lingering on Vivina with a mixture of contempt and cruel curiosity. Arthur felt a cold anger rise in him. He helped Vivina down from the wagon, his hand lingering on her arm for a moment longer than necessary, a small, defiant gesture of protection. Inside the store, the air was thick with disapproval. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man Arthur had traded with for years, served him with a clipped, cold formality, his eyes constantly flicking toward Vivina, who stood silently by the door, her head held high. The real trouble started as they were loading their supplies. A man stepped out of the saloon, swaggering toward them. It was Garrett Vance, a rancher from a neighboring spread, a man known for his mean streak and his loud, ignorant opinions. He had a few of his equally unsavory hands with him. "Well now, McBride," Vance sneered, his eyes raking over Vivina, "I heard you were keeping company, but I didn't figure it was this kind." "This is none of your concern, Vance," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. He moved to stand slightly in front of Vivina. "Ain't it?" Vance spat a stream of tobacco juice near Vivina's feet. "There's been talk of renegades from the reservation, stealing livestock. Maybe we found one." "She's with me," Arthur said, the words as hard as granite. "She's under my protection. Now back away." Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Protection? You bring this filth into our town, near our women and children, and you talk about protection." He took a step closer, his hand dropping to the pistol at his belt. "I say we take her to the sheriff. Let him sort it out." The air crackled with tension. The other men with Vance fanned out, their expressions hungry for violence. Arthur's mind raced. He was one man against four. He could see Clara's face, pale with fear, peeking over the edge of the wagon seat. This was what he had been afraid of. The sanctuary he had built was nothing but a fragile shell against the hatred of the world. "I'm telling you for the last time, Vance," Arthur said, his body coiled like a spring. "Get on your horse and ride out." For a long moment, no one moved. The dust motes swirled in the tense silence. Then Vance's eyes met Arthur's, and perhaps he saw something in Thema resolve he hadn't expected, a willingness to die right there on that dusty street. With a final, contemptuous sneer, Vance shrugged. "Have it your way, McBride," he said, his voice full of menace. "But a man who beds down with savages will get what's coming to him. You mark my words." He and his men turned and sauntered back to the saloon, their laughter echoing behind them. Arthur quickly finished loading the wagon, his hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. The ride home was silent, but it was a different silence than before. It was the silence of a shared threat, a danger that now bound them together as surely as any vow. He looked at Vivina. Her face was a stoic mask, but he could see the tremor in her hands. He reached across the seat and took one of her hands in his. It was cold. He held it all the way back to the ranch. The threat of Vance's words hung over the following days like a storm cloud on the horizon. Arthur became hyper-vigilant, sleeping with his rifle by his bed, starting at every scrape of a branch against the roof, every howl of the wind. The peace they had found felt fragile, a candle flame flickering in a gale. He saw the same tension in Vivina. She kept Clara close, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The storm broke a week later. It was dusk, the sky bruised with purple and orange. A cold front was moving in, and the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow. Arthur had just finished securing the livestock for the night when he saw them. 4 riders, dark silhouettes against the fading light, coming fast. It was Vance and his men. "Vivina, get inside. Take Clara to the root cellar," he yelled, grabbing his rifle from its pegs by the door. Vivina's eyes met his, wide with fear, but also with a fierce resolve. "No," she said, her voice steady. "We will face them together." She pushed a terrified Clara behind her and grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. The riders pulled up just beyond the pool of light from the cabin's window, their faces shadowed and sinister. They were drunk, their voices loud and belligerent. "McBride," Vance bellowed, "we've come for what's ours. The town council decided. That squaw belongs to the reservation authorities. We're a citizens' posse, come to collect her." It was a lie, and they all knew it. There was no town council, no authorities. There was only drunken malice and prejudice looking for an outlet. "You're on my land, Vance," Arthur shouted back, his rifle held steady. "You're not welcome here. Turn around and ride out before you get hurt." "We're not leaving without the savage," one of the other men yelled, and he spurred his horse forward. Arthur fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed across the plains, sharp and definitive. The horse shied violently, nearly unseating its rider. "The next one won't be in the air, Vance," Arthur warned, his voice ringing with a cold fury he hadn't known he possessed. Vance dismounted, pulling his own pistol. "You're a fool, McBride. You'd die for her." "I'd die for my family," Arthur said, and the word felt truer than anything he had ever spoken. He glanced back. Vivina stood in the doorway, poker held like a weapon, her body a shield in front of his daughter. They were a line, a fortress wall of three. Vance and his men started to advance on foot, spreading out to approach from different angles. The situation was spiraling out of control. It was 4 against 1 armed man and a woman with a fireplace tool. The odds were impossible. Then something happened that no one expected. From behind Vivina's legs, a small, terrified figure darted out onto the porch. It was Clara. Her face was streaked with tears, her small body trembling. She looked at the menacing figures advancing on her home, on her father, on the woman who had taught her to smile again. And she screamed. It was not a child's cry of fear. It was a raw, primal sound of pure rage, a sound torn from the deepest parts of her soul. It was the collective anguish of a lost mother, a silent father, and a stolen childhood, all unleashed in one piercing, shattering shriek that cut through the wind and the men's drunken shouts. The effect was electric. Vance and his men stopped dead in their tracks, stunned into silence by the sheer, unexpected force of the sound coming from the tiny child. They stared, mouths agape. In that moment of shocked hesitation, Arthur saw his chance. He wasn't aiming to kill, but to end this. He leveled his rifle and fired again, the bullet thudding into the wooden porch post right beside Vance's head. Splinters flew, and Vance yelped, scrambling backward and falling in the dirt. That broke the spell. The drunken courage evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sober fear. Vance's men looked at their fallen leader, at the determined man with the rifle, at the fierce woman with the iron poker, and at the small child who had just screamed with the fury of a she-bear. This wasn't the easy sport they had imagined. "Let's get out of here," one of them yelled. They scrambled back to their horses, hauling a sputtering Vance up with them. In a clatter of hoofbeats and shouted curses, they galloped away into the darkness, swallowed by the vast, indifferent plains. Silence descended, broken only by the keening of the wind and Clara's ragged sobs. Arthur lowered his rifle, his entire body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. He rushed to the porch and swept Clara up into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "It's all right. You're safe. We're all safe." Vivina came and put a hand on his back. Her hand was steady. He looked at her over Clara's head, and in the dim light from the cabin, he saw everything in her eyes: relief, fear, and a deep, abiding gratitude. In that moment, the last of the walls around Arthur's heart came down, washed away by the flood of fierce, protective love he felt for the two people before him. He hadn't just defended his property, he had defended his home. In the quiet aftermath, a new reality settled over them. The violent confrontation had not broken them, it had forged them. The shared danger had burned away all remaining doubt and hesitation, leaving behind a bond as strong and resilient as forged steel. They were no longer 3 separate wounded souls seeking shelter under one roof. They were a family. The first snow fell that night, a soft white blanket that covered the tracks of Vance and his men, purifying the land and muffling the world in a profound peace. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire was a stark contrast to the cold outside. Clara, exhausted by her ordeal, fell asleep in Arthur's arms, her breathing deep and even. He carried her to her cot and tucked her in, kissing her forehead. The wooden bird Vivina had carved for her lay on the pillow beside her head. He turned to find Vivina watching him, her expression soft. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken understanding. "She was so brave," Vivina said quietly. "She learned it from you," Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. He walked over to where she stood by the hearth. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. All the unspoken things, the gratitude, the admiration, the deep, growing affection passed between them in that single, simple gesture. He was no longer just the man who had saved her life. And she was no longer just the woman he had rescued. They were two halves of a whole they had built together out of the wreckage of their pasts. Life on the ranch found its true and final rhythm. The winter was hard, but the cabin was a bastion of warmth and light. Clara's voice, once unlocked, now filled the small space with questions, stories, and songs. She followed Vivina everywhere, learning the Cheyenne words for sun and moon, for horse and bird. She was healing, blossoming under the gentle sun of Vivina's care. Arthur healed too. The heavy shroud of his grief began to lift, not vanishing but thinning, allowing the light to filter through. He started to laugh again, a rough, rusty sound at first, but one that grew more frequent and natural. He found joy in simple things. The sight of Vivina and Clara gathering dried herbs, their heads bent close together, the taste of a stew seasoned with wild roots he'd never known existed. The quiet evenings spent together by the fire, sharing stories. The wind no longer sounded like a lament to him, it sounded like a whisper of promise. Vivina, in turn, had found her home. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was replaced by a serene confidence. She belonged here. The land that had almost claimed her had, in the end, given her a new life. She planted a small garden in the spring, in the same spot where Martha's had failed. But under Vivina's knowing hands, using seeds she had carefully saved, green shoots pushed their way through the stubborn soil. One evening in early summer, Arthur stood on the porch, watching as Vivina showed Clara how to gently water the new seedlings. The setting sun cast them in a golden light, their silhouettes blending together. Clara laughed, a pure, happy sound that was now the true music of the ranch. Vivina looked up and saw him watching, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. In that moment, Arthur McBride understood the profound truth of his journey. He had stumbled upon a dying woman in a creek bed and, in an act of reluctant humanity, had brought her into his home. But in saving her, he had done so much more. She had, in turn, rescued him from the silent prison of his grief, and she had given his daughter back her voice, her childhood, her future. He had thought he was offering shelter from the storm, when all along she was the one bringing the life-giving rain to his barren world. He had found more than a survivor. He had found the missing piece of his own soul. The wind across the high plains of Wyoming Territory had a voice, and in the winter of 1884 it spoke only of endings. It was a mournful sound that scoured the lonely cabin of Caleb Shaw, a man who had become an expert in the language of desolation. The cabin stood like a single stubborn tooth against a sweeping jaw of rock and ice, miles from any neighbor, leagues from any town. This was how Caleb wanted it. The silence inside was a match for the silence he carried in his soul, a hollow space carved out by a loss so profound it had stolen his words and left him with only the rhythms of survival. Chop wood, draw water, mend fence, endure. His life was a loop of grey chores under a grey sky. He moved with the economy of a man who had no one to waste emotion for. He spoke only to his horse, a stoic grey gelding named Ghost, and then only in clipped, necessary commands. The memories that haunted him were formless, spectres of warmth and laughter he could no longer attach to a face or a name. There had been a wife, a child. Their graves were marked by two simple wooden crosses on a rise overlooking the creek, their names weathered away by the same relentless wind that scoured his heart. He was a ghost himself, haunting the edges of a life that had ended long ago, leaving only the shell of a man to go through the motions. One afternoon, with the sky turning the bruised color of an old contusion, he rode out to check his fences, chasing a few stray head of cattle that had wandered toward the broken country to the north, the lands the Cheyenne called their own. The air grew heavy, unnaturally still, the way it always did before the world came apart. He knew the signs. He turned Ghost for home, but he was too late. The blizzard did not arrive. It materialized. One moment, he was riding through a world of muted browns and grays. The next, he was lost in a blinding, vertical sea of white. The wind screamed, a physical force that tore the breath from his lungs and shoved ice crystals into his eyes. He lost all direction, all sense of up from down. He dismounted, pressing his face into Ghost's warm neck, trying to use the animal's instinct to guide them. They stumbled on, step by agonizing step, until the ground simply vanished from beneath them. Horse and rider tumbled into a shallow, snow-choked ravine. Caleb felt a sickening crack as his head struck something hard and unyielding, a rock hidden beneath the snow. Then the screaming wind, the biting cold, the crushing weight of the world, it all faded into a profound and absolute darkness. Consciousness returned not as a sudden light, but as a slow, seeping warmth. It began in his chest and spread outward, chasing a chill that seemed to have settled deep in his bones. He was aware of softness beneath him, the heavy weight of furs above him, and a scent he couldn't place: wood smoke, sage, and something else, something deeply unfamiliar. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt like lead shutters. A low murmur of voices reached him, a language that flowed like water over stones, musical and strange. When he finally managed to force his eyes open, the world was a blur of firelight and shadow. He was inside a lodge, the curved walls made of hide, stretched over a frame of poles. A small fire crackled in the center, its smoke rising to a hole in the roof. But it was not the strange dwelling that seized his attention. It was the faces. 7 women. They were seated around him, their expressions a mixture of concern, curiosity, and an unnerving, profound expectation. They were Cheyenne, their dark hair braided, their faces etched with the quiet dignity of their people. Their clothing was practical buckskin, adorned with simple quillwork. They were of varying ages, from a young woman who looked barely more than a girl to another whose eyes held the wisdom of many hard seasons. He tried to sit up, but a sharp, blinding pain shot through his head, and he fell back with a groan. One of the women, the one who seemed to be the eldest, leaned forward. Her face was stern but not unkind. "Be still," she said. Her English was clear, though accented. "The wound on your head is deep. You have slept for 3 days." Caleb's throat was dry, his voice a raw croak. Where am I?" "You are safe," she answered, her gaze unwavering. "We found you in the storm. The spirit of the wind nearly claimed you." He looked from her face to the others. They watched him, their dark eyes like pools of ink, reflecting the firelight. A terrifying blankness filled his mind where his memories should have been. He searched for a name, a place, a single fact about himself, and found nothing. It was like looking into a house and finding all the furniture gone, the walls bare, the floors swept clean of any evidence that someone had ever lived there. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of his pain. Who am I?" The woman's expression softened for a fraction of a second. "Your name is Caleb Shaw. You live in the lonely cabin by the creek. Do you not remember?" He shook his head, the movement sending another wave of agony through his skull. I don't remember anything." A silence fell over the lodge, thick and heavy with unspoken thoughts. The women exchanged glances, a silent conversation he could not comprehend. The eldest one, who he now saw as their clear leader, took a deep breath. She seemed to be choosing her next words with immense care. "It does not matter," she said finally, her voice firm, as if stating an unalterable law. "The arrangement was made. Your memory does not change it." Caleb pushed himself up on one elbow, his confusion warring with a rising tide of fear. "Arrangement? What arrangement?" The woman looked at the 6 others, then back at him. Her eyes held the weight of a desperate bargain, of a future gambled on a single promise. "We are your wives," she said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. "All of us. You made a promise. You gave your word you would protect us. Now, we have saved you. We have held up our part. You must hold up yours." He stared at them, at the 7 solemn faces illuminated by the flickering fire. Wives. The word was alien, impossible. The empty space in his head echoed with the absurdity of it. He was a man without a past, a ghost awakened in a strange land, and he was surrounded by 7 women who claimed he belonged to them, a debt he had no memory of incurring, a promise he had no idea how to keep. The days that followed were a waking dream, a tapestry of confusion and guarded observation. The women moved with a quiet, practiced grace, their lives governed by rhythms as old as the land itself. Caleb remained weak, confined to the warm prison of the buffalo robes. His head throbbed with a persistent, dull ache, and the void in his memory remained absolute. He was a slate wiped clean, and these women were the only ones who could write upon it. He learned their names. The leader, the one who spoke for them all, was Neva. She was perhaps 40 winters old, with a strength in her gaze that seemed capable of holding back the mountains. There was Sotayo, the healer, who tended his head wound with poultices of crushed herbs that smelled of damp earth and pine. She was quiet, her hands gentle and sure. Vivina was younger, with eyes that burned with a fierce, protective fire. She always seemed to be watching the entrance of the lodge, a knife never far from her hand. The youngest was Mesa, whose shy glances were often filled with a hesitant kindness, as if she pitied his confusion. The other 3 sisters, whose names he struggled to remember, were a constant, watchful presence, their hands always busy with tanning hides, sewing moccasins, or preparing food. Their care was constant, but it was not tender. It was practical, efficient, the way one might care for a valuable animal that had been injured. They fed him a thin, nourishing broth and a bitter tea that eased the pain in his head. They spoke to him in their careful English, but among themselves the fluid sounds of Cheyenne flowed freely, leaving him in an isolating bubble of incomprehension. He felt less like a husband and more like a piece of property they were carefully restoring. Mistrust was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was a white man. He knew this much from his reflection in a small pot of water. Every story he couldn't remember surely told him that his people and theirs were not friends. Why would they save him? Why would they claim him? The word wives hung in the air, a preposterous and menacing cloud. He had no memory of desire, of love, of making a promise to one woman, let alone 7. "Why?" he asked Neva one evening, his voice stronger than it had been. The others were busy with their tasks, but he knew they were listening. "Why me? I have nothing. I don't even have a name beyond the one you give me." Neva paused in her work, mending a tear in a winter cloak. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You have land," she said simply. "A cabin. Rifles. You had a horse, but it broke its leg in the fall. You have the protection that comes with your skin." The last words were spoken without bitterness, as a simple statement of fact. "Protection from who?" he pressed. A shadow passed over her face. "There are men prospectors, wolfers, who believe this land is empty for the taking. They believe our lives are also for the taking. Our band was small. A sickness came with the last snows. Then soldiers came, looking for warriors who were not there. They left only us, 7 women alone. It is not a good thing to be in this country." Caleb processed this slowly. His mind was a blank canvas, but instinct painted a grim picture of what she was describing. "So you found me, a stranger, and decided I would be your husband." "It was not so simple," Neva corrected, her voice sharp. "We did not find you. We sought you out. An arrangement was made before the storm. A trader in the south told us of you. A man alone, a man who had lost his own family and wanted no part of the world. A man with a strong back and a good rifle who kept to himself. A man who might understand loss." She paused, her gaze turning inward for a moment. "We offered you all we had left, our skills, our loyalty. In exchange for your name, your roof, your protection. You agreed. You gave your word on it." The story was plausible, yet it felt like a tale about someone else. He could not connect with the man she described. This grieving recluse, who would make such a desperate pact, felt as alien to him as the women themselves. I don't remember." It was the only truth he had. "The blow to your head stole it," Sotayo said softly, speaking for the first time that evening. She looked up from the herbs she was grinding. But a promise is not in the head, it is in the heart. It lives there even if the mind forgets. As his body healed, the forced intimacy of the lodge began to chafe. He was allowed to get up, to move around the small space. He watched them work, their hands never idle. He saw Vivina sharpening her knife with a focused intensity. He saw Mesa painstakingly stitching intricate patterns with colored quills onto a piece of leather. He saw the easy, unspoken rhythm of their cooperation. They were a unit, a family forged in sorrow and survival, and he was the strange, broken piece that didn't fit. He started to help. He had no memory of skills, but his hands did. He found he knew how to mend a leather strap, how to bank a fire to last the night, how to check the tension on a bowstring. These small actions were like echoes of a former self, faint whispers from a life he couldn't grasp. One afternoon, he took the heavy water buckets from Mesa's small hands, his own hands closing over hers for a brief moment. She pulled away as if burned, her face flushing, and hurried back inside the lodge. But later, when Neva served the evening meal of rabbit stew, he noticed his portion had the most meat. Slowly, painstakingly, the walls of suspicion began to develop small cracks. He learned that their survival was a precarious, day-to-day struggle. The arrangement with him had been their last, desperate hope to anchor themselves against a world determined to erase them. His amnesia had not just been a personal tragedy for him. For them, it was a potential catastrophe. Their protector, the man whose word they had staked their lives on, was a hollow shell. One day, Neva led him outside the lodge. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the snow deep and unbroken save for their tracks. She pointed to a distant smudge of smoke against the gray sky. "Your cabin," she said. "We brought you here because it was closer when the storm hit. We have been sending Vivina to tend your stock." Staring at that thin plume of smoke, he felt the first flicker of something beyond confusion. A pull, a sense of a place that belonged to him, even if he didn't belong to it. "I need to go back," he said, the words surprising him with their certainty. Neva nodded slowly. "We will all go. It is our home now, too." That was the promise. The journey to his cabin was a silent, trudging procession through the deep snow. When they arrived, the place felt both strange and achingly familiar. His hands knew where the latch was. His feet knew which floorboard creaked. The oppressive silence he had once cultivated was now filled with the soft rustle of their movements, the low murmur of their voices. They explored the small two-room cabin with a quiet, assessing curiosity, their eyes taking in the sturdy walls, the stone fireplace, the few meager possessions. It was a fortress of solitude, and they were an army laying siege to his loneliness. He found 2 rifles mounted over the fireplace, and the feel of the cool wood and steel in his hands was as natural as breathing. He checked them instinctively, his fingers moving with an ingrained knowledge he didn't know he possessed. Vivina watched him, a flicker of something, perhaps approval, in her stoic eyes. They settled into a new routine, a strange and unspoken domesticity. They were tireless workers, turning his neglected cabin into a functional home. They cleaned, cooked, mended his worn clothes, and organized his supplies with an efficiency that shamed his previous solitary existence. Caleb, in turn, found himself falling into the role of provider. He took one of the rifles and went out hunting, his body remembering the hunt, the stillness, the patience, the clean shot. When he returned with a deer slung over his shoulders, the look of profound relief on their faces was the first real reward he had felt since waking up. Yet the arrangement remained a constant, unspoken tension. At night, they laid out their bedrolls in the main room, while he slept alone in the small adjoining bedroom, the door left slightly ajar. They were his wives in name, but they kept a respectful, almost fearful distance. There was no intimacy, only a shared, desperate purpose. He was the shield, and they were the heart of this strange, fragile home. He began to see that his forgotten promise was not about desire, but about duty. He was a wall they needed to stand behind, and he was beginning to feel the weight of that responsibility, even without the memory of accepting it. One evening, as Sotayo was tending to the dressing on his head, which was now nearly healed, her fingers brushed against his temple. It was a light, accidental touch, but it sent a jolt through him. A flash of memory, so fleeting he wasn't sure he hadn't imagined. Ita woman's laughter, the sun warm on his face, the small hand of a child tucked into his. He gasped, his breath catching in his throat. Sotayo pulled her hand back quickly. "What is it?" "Nothing," he lied, his heart pounding. "A twitch." But it wasn't nothing. It was a crack in the wall of his emptiness. For the first time, he felt the ghost of the man he had been, a man who had known love, who had a family. And with that flicker of memory came a wave of grief so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He finally understood the man Neva had described, the grieving recluse who would agree to such a bargain. He was a man who had nothing left to lose, and perhaps a man who saw in their desperation a reflection of his own. That night, lying in his cold bed, he didn't feel like their captive or their guardian. He felt a kinship with them, a shared understanding of what it meant to have your world burned down and be left standing alone in the ashes. The fragile peace of their new existence was shattered by the arrival of 3 riders. Caleb saw them from a distance, dark figures moving against the snow, and his gut tightened with an instinct he didn't know he had. He called out a sharp warning, and the women vanished inside the cabin with practiced speed, as if they had been drilling for this moment their entire lives. Vivina appeared at his side, a rifle in her hands, her face a mask of grim resolve. "Go inside," he told her, his voice low. "Bar the door." "I will stand with you," she stated, not as a request, but as a fact. He didn't have time to argue. The riders were closing in. The man in the lead was large and bearded, with a cruel twist to his mouth. His name was Garrett Vance, a prospector with a reputation for taking what he wanted. He and his men had been sniffing around this territory for months, seeing the Cheyenne women not as people, but as obstacles to the land they coveted. Vance reined in his horse a dozen yards from the cabin, his eyes sweeping over Caleb and then lingering on Vivina with a greedy leer. "Well now, sure heard you took in some strays. Getting lonely out here, were you?" Caleb kept his rifle held loosely, pointed at the ground, but ready. "This is my land, Vance. State your business and ride on." Vance chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Your land? This is sovereign territory, and last I checked, harboring hostiles is a federal offense. Those women are trespassers. I'm just here to encourage them to move along. Give them to us, and we'll forget we ever saw you." "They're not going anywhere," Caleb said, his voice cold and steady. The words came from a place deeper than memory, a core of defiance he was only just discovering. In that moment, he wasn't just protecting them because of a forgotten promise. He was protecting them because they were his. This strange, broken family was his. "Wrong answer," Vance sneered. He reached for the pistol on his hip, but he underestimated the woman beside Caleb. Vivina was faster. Her rifle came up in a blur of motion, and a shot cracked through the frigid air. It wasn't aimed to kill, but to warn. The bullet kicked up snow inches from Vance's horse, causing the animal to rear violently. One of Vance's men, startled, drew his own weapon. From inside the cabin, another shot rang out. A window pane shattered, and the man's hat flew from his head. Neva was at the window, her face set like stone. Vance fought his horse under control, his face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this, sure. All of you will." He wheeled his horse around, and he and his men galloped away, disappearing back into the vast, white emptiness. A tense silence fell. Caleb's heart was hammering against his ribs. He looked at Vivina, whose knuckles were white on her rifle stock. He looked back at the cabin, where Neva's face was still framed in the broken window. They hadn't flinched. They had stood their ground. They had stood with him. "They will be back," Vivina said, her voice flat. "Tonight, when the moon is down." He knew she was right. This was not over. It was only the beginning. The external threat had arrived, and it would test their fragile alliance to its breaking point. For the first time, Caleb was not just a man with no past, he was a man with a future to defend. The rest of the day passed in a blur of grim preparation. There was no panic, only a focused, determined energy. Under Neva's quiet direction, they barricaded the windows, leaving small slits to shoot through. They brought in the last of the firewood and filled every bucket with water. So Tayo prepared bandages and checked their meager supply of medicinal herbs. Caleb cleaned and loaded his rifles, and the one pistol he owned, his hands moving with a fluid, deadly certainty that felt both foreign and innate. He worked alongside them, shoulder to shoulder, no longer the outsider but an integral part of their defense. He showed Mesa how to reload the spare rifle quickly, her small hands fumbling at first, then growing steady under his calm instruction. He and Vivina scouted the perimeter of the cabin, planning lines of fire, communicating in clipped sentences and gestures, a soldier's language that they both seemed to understand implicitly. The barrier of language and culture had evaporated, burned away by the heat of their shared danger. As dusk bled across the snow, painting the landscape in shades of violet and indigo, they gathered in the dim light of the cabin. The fire was banked low to avoid giving Vance an easy target. Neva handed Caleb a bowl of stew. Their eyes met over the flickering candlelight. "You did not have to do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You could have given us to them, saved yourself." Caleb thought of the blankness in his mind, the hollow ache that had been his only companion. He thought of the quiet industry of these women, their resilience, their fierce will to live. They had filled the silence of his cabin and the silence in his soul. They had given him a purpose when he had none. "This is my home," he said, the words feeling truer than any memory he might have lost. "You are my family." The last word felt strange on his tongue, but it was honest. A flicker of something warm and profound passed through Neva's eyes, an acknowledgement that went deeper than words. The attack came in the dead of night, under the sliver of a waning moon. It began not with a shout, but with the sudden, terrifying whoosh of fire. One of Vance's men had crept close and thrown a lit torch onto the cabin roof. The dry shingles caught immediately. "Fire!" Caleb yelled, grabbing a bucket of water. Vivina was already moving, shoving him toward the ladder that led to the small loft. "I will hold them off. You stop the flames." Gunshots erupted from the darkness outside, splintering the wood of the cabin walls. Neva and the others returned fire from the windows, their shots measured and deliberate. Caleb scrambled up the ladder, choking on the smoke that was already filling the small space. He beat at the flames with a wet blanket, the heat searing his face, sparks stinging his skin. Below him, the cabin was filled with the cacophony of the firefight, the sharp crack of rifles, the shattering of glass, the defiant shouts of the women. He fought the fire with a desperate fury, knowing that if the roof went, they were lost. He could hear Vance outside, bellowing orders, his voice thick with rage. A bullet tore through the roof near Caleb's head, and he flattened himself, his heart pounding. The flames were spreading. He was losing. Suddenly, Mesa was beside him, a bucket of water in her hands, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes wide and determined. Together they battled the blaze, passing buckets, smothering the flames, working as one. On the ground floor, Vivina moved like a shadow. She fired from one window, then dropped and crawled to another, creating the illusion of more defenders than they had. One of Vance's men made the mistake of getting too close, trying to light another torch. A single shot from Vivina's rifle sent him screaming into the snow, clutching a shattered shoulder. The fight raged, a chaotic symphony of fire and lead. Caleb and Mesa finally managed to extinguish the last of the flames on the roof. He looked down and saw that one of the sisters was injured, Tayo pressing a cloth to her arm, while Neva continued to fire calmly out the window. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and their fortress was burning down around them, but they were not broken. Caleb knew they couldn't win a prolonged siege. He had to end it. Making a decision that was pure, lethal instinct, he grabbed his pistol. "Keep them pinned," he yelled down to Neva. Before anyone could stop him, he kicked open the loft door and leaped out into the snow, rolling behind a stack of firewood. The sudden move took Vance's men by surprise. Caleb came up firing, his pistol bucking in his hand. One man went down, the other scrambled for cover. Vance, seeing his advantage slipping away, roared in frustration and charged toward Caleb, firing wildly. Caleb ducked behind the woodpile, bullets thudding into the logs. He was out of ammunition for the pistol. It was just him and Vance now. But he was not alone. From the darkness on his flank, an arrow hissed through the air and embedded itself deep in Vance's thigh. The big man cried out in pain and surprise, stumbling. He looked over to see Vivina, a bow in her hand, her expression deadly. The distraction was all Caleb needed. He launched himself at Vance, tackling him to the ground. They rolled in the snow, a desperate grunting struggle. Vance was bigger, stronger, but Caleb was fueled by a cold, protective rage he had never known. His hands found Vance's throat, squeezing, cutting off the man's air. Vance's eyes bulged, his hands clawing at Caleb's face. Just as Caleb's vision started to blur from lack of oxygen, the weight on him lessened. Neva stood over them, the butt of her rifle raised. She brought it down once, hard, on the side of Vance's head. He went limp. The remaining conscious henchman, seeing his leader down and his companion wounded, decided he'd had enough. He scrambled to his feet and fled into the night, dragging his injured comrade with him. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the smoldering roof and the ragged breaths of the survivors. Caleb pushed himself off Vance's unconscious form, gasping for air. He was bruised, smoke-choked, and utterly exhausted, but he was alive. They were all alive. He looked at the women emerging from the cabin. Soteo was already tending to the wounded sister. Mesa was staring at him, her fear giving way to awe. Vivina retrieved her arrow from Vance's leg with a grim satisfaction, and Neva looked at him, and for the first time he saw not a business partner, not a dependent, but an equal, a comrade. "The promise is kept," she said softly, her words carrying on the cold night air. Caleb looked at the damaged cabin, at the weary, smoke-stained faces of the women around him. He still couldn't remember the man who had made that promise, but it didn't matter anymore. He had forged a new one tonight, not with words, but with blood and fire and courage. He had found his memory not in the past, but in the fierce, desperate present. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, a new kind of peace settled over the cabin. The rising sun cast a pale, gentle light on a scene of devastation and survival. They worked together to patch the roof, to sweep up the shattered glass, to tend to their wounded. Vance and his men were gone, their threat neutralized, leaving behind only the lingering scent of gunpowder and scorched wood. The unspoken tension that had defined their cohabitation was gone, replaced by a deep, earned camaraderie. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, their shared ordeal having forged a bond stronger than any forgotten contract. When Caleb's eyes met Neva's, there was a shared understanding that needed no words. When Mesa handed him a cup of water, her hand no longer trembled. A few days later, as Caleb was splitting wood, he felt a flicker behind his eyes. It was stronger this time, a memory, clear and sharp. He was standing on the rise behind the cabin, his arm around a woman with warm brown hair. A little girl with her mother's eyes was chasing a butterfly in the tall grass. The sun was on their faces, and he could hear their laughter, as real as the axe in his hands. Her name was Hannah, the girl was Rose. The grief hit him like a physical blow, so intense he dropped the axe and staggered back, leaning against the cabin wall for support. The hollow space inside him was suddenly filled with an agony, so acute he could barely breathe. It was all there, the love, the joy, and the devastating emptiness that had followed the fever that took them both. Neva found him there, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She did not speak. She simply stood beside him, a quiet, steady presence, until the storm of his sorrow began to pass. "I remember," he finally rasped, his voice raw. "I remember them." "I know," she said softly. "We knew you were a man who had loved greatly. It is why we chose you. A man who has never had his heart broken cannot know how to protect the hearts of others." He looked at her, his vision blurred with tears. The promise, "I made it because I had nothing left, because I didn't care if I lived or died." "And now?" she asked, her gaze gentle but piercing. Caleb looked at the cabin, where he could hear the low murmur of the other women's voices. He thought of Vivina's courage, Sotayo's healing hands, Mesa's quiet strength. He thought of how they had fought for this place, for each other, for him. The lonely cowboy who woke up surrounded by strangers was gone. In his place was a man who had found something new to live for. "Now," he said, his voice gaining strength, "I have something to protect. A home, a family." The word no longer felt strange, it felt right. His past was a landscape of love and loss, a place of ghosts he would always carry. But his future was here, in this small cabin on the vast, wind-swept plains, with these 7 resilient women. The arrangement, born of desperation, had blossomed into something else entirely, a shared destiny. They had saved him from the storm, and he, in turn, had become the shield for their survival. Together, they had created a new story, one not of memory but of choice, a testament to the fact that sometimes a home is not a place you remember, but a place you build, promise by promise, in the face of the wind.